Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Yes, it's that time. Salutations and welcome. I'm your host, Matthew DeSantis, and as you might suspect, this is not From the Swamp to the Swamp, but rather Amalfi at the Derby. That's right. It's the start of the Triple Crown and the race for the Triple Crown and the most exciting 2 minutes in sports. The Kentucky Derby, which is going to be run this weekend on Saturday, May 1st. And I have to say, I have my Derby outfit. I got my little Derby hat. I got my tan suit for the springtime, and I'm all set for the Derby. I'm going to be making my mint julep, having some Derby pie, and watching horse racing, which is a sport I absolutely love and adore and have for years. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Kentucky Derby, some of the favorites and some of the dark horses in the race this year, the Run for the Roses, and talk a little bit about the general approach to perhaps betting on this race, as well as some of the general trends to keep in mind regarding horse racing this year as we emerge from the pandemic. But the Kentucky Derby, in so many ways, is going to be the start of, in my eyes at least, the sports season. I know some people probably think professional baseball is the start of the spring, but some stadiums don't allow for much more than maybe 20% capacity. But we're going to be looking at about 45,000 people attending Churchill Downs on Saturday, May 1st. And that's going to be a really special time, obviously. And horse racing in general has been something that's really sustained a lot of people. I'll be honest, myself particularly, through the pandemic. It was one of the few sports that ran almost continuously uninterrupted during the pandemic. And, it was a lot of fun to watch and follow. And I definitely will talk a little bit more about that later. But, it's interesting. The Kentucky Derby is a traditional rite of spring passage. But much like with golf, and if you've watched some of our other sports-related videos, myself and Joey DePinto, who's the co-host of the Amalfi Media podcast Binge Bros, he and I were talking about the Masters a few weeks ago in professional golf. And in professional men's golf, the four majors got kind of thrown out of whack last year. The order and the schedule was all thrown off. And this year, or I should say last year, the same thing happened with horse racing. The Triple Crown is traditionally run in a very precise way, so that it is the Kentucky Derby first, the Preakness, which is in Pimlico in Baltimore, second, and then the Belmont is third. And the Belmont is, of course, the longest of the three. So the Kentucky Derby being a mile and a quarter, the Pimlico and the Preakness being a mile and an eighth, and then the Belmont being a mile and a half. And last year, because of the pandemic and because of the disruption, at least to the horse racing calendar early in the spring, what happened was the Belmont actually became the first leg of the Triple Crown, and it also shortened the length of the race. But now we are back to the traditional setup, and I think there's a certain sense of familiarity to that the Kentucky Derby will kick off the start of the horse racing season. Of course, there have been tons of races leading up to the Kentucky Derby. I think for most of the casual sports fans who tune into the Kentucky Derby, this is the start of the horse racing season. But the reality is that these horses that are racing in the Kentucky Derby have been actively racing all winter and spring, getting ready and preparing for the Derby. And that is an interesting facet, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in terms of how do you understand horse racing? Do you understand it through the lens of the Triple Crown or through the broader perspective of the yearly horse racing process? And that's a little bit different, and it requires, I think, a little bit more attention to be paid. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this Saturday, May 1st, post time, 6:57 p.m., make sure you're in front of your televisions or devices to make sure that you can tune into that, 6:57 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I'm talking about horse racing, but horse racing, it's interesting. It's a niche sport in some ways. It's a sport that certainly the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness and the Belmont tend to capture people's imaginations. The race for the Triple Crown is always something that is talked about widely in popular sports. But a real love of horse racing is few and far between, unfortunately. I think that's probably even more true for people of my age and generation. I think people who are a little bit older, certainly someone my father's age, remembers the great super horses of, Secretariat and Affirmed and Aladar and Seattle Slew, and remember these great horses from from the 70s. And horse racing kind of got a little bit into a rut, and it became it didn't become a huge spectator sport for a younger generation of people. And so for a lot of young people, they understand it through the Triple Crown and the Derby and the Preakness and the Belmont, but they don't follow horse racing quite as closely as others might in previous generations. But I've always loved horse racing, and part of it was because I grew up not too far from a racetrack in Pennsylvania. My dad would take me to Penn National, and we would joke that the next stop, if the horses lost at Penn National, the next stop was the glue factory. It was certainly not the creme de la creme of the horse racing community that was racing there. There's a lot of people. You wonder sometimes if they just, unhooked a horse from, pulling an Amish buggy and kind of put them out on the racetrack. I mean, it wasn't the highest caliber, but it was a lot of fun. And I remember my dad would secretly place bets for me because I was, only 12 or 13 years old. Obviously couldn't bet, but he taught me how to read a racing form and would, give me, I would have $2 and I would say, put a $2 bet on this horse. And I always picked the horse with the best odds. That was the thing. And so I would make like $2.60 on a $2 bet. But when you're 12 years old, winning 60 cents seems like a pretty great thing. And it certainly was for me. And so it was just a lot of fun. And I've kept that passion of horse racing throughout my life. So I've been to the Kentucky Derby once, been to the Preakness as well. I've been to Churchill several times. And I've also been to Belmont Park, not for the Belmont race, but been to the park, been to Saratoga, which is just absolutely beautiful. Visited my good friend Anders Matson up there and his wife Janice. Just truly a beautiful, beautiful racetrack and beautiful setting in upstate New York. Obviously lived in Florida for a while. Used to go to Tampa Downs, a lot of great races there. And it was always great to watch horse racing when it was cold in the rest of the country and it was nice and warm in Central Florida. And even when I lived in Texas, I would go to Retama Park in a little town called Selma, Texas, which was halfway between Austin and San Antonio. And they'd run quarter horses there. I used to love going to that. So, just enjoy horse racing. I follow it all the time. So one of my favorite programs to watch if I'm just kind of bored on a Saturday or Sunday is America's Day at the Races on Fox Sports. So a lot of times it's on FS1 or FS2, and it just goes all across the country. Sometimes they're at Saratoga, sometimes they're at Churchill, sometimes they're showing races from Aqueduct and Colonial Downs, not far from me in Virginia. And so they'll be showing races from all over the country, and just really a lot of fun to keep track of the horses. And you start to kind of, if you watch it enough, you start to see the same horses emerge, racing again every few weeks or every few months. And so it's just a great way to get to know horse racing a little bit more and to get to understand how to handicap horse racing. And if you want to put a little bit of money down, great. But if not, it's just still a lot of fun to be able to, in your mind, watch the horses during the post parade and go, I think I like the 7 horse and I like the 9 horse. And, and then, you watch them and maybe the 7 and the 9 come in first and second. And, you just go, hey, I should have put money on that race. But it's still a lot of fun to watch and follow. And certainly being there in person is always a blast. And just seeing the horses, which are just such majestic animals. And I love being around horses. I've been fortunate to know a lot of great horse people in my life. And so it's just been, and have actually have a former student who has her own farm now and is racing thoroughbreds. And so hope to potentially have her on the podcast and video here in the future, maybe before the Preakness or the Belmont. So it's just been a great kind of lifetime love of horse racing. So let's talk a little bit about horse racing in recent years. And I think one of the things that has emerged and popped up into me is the rise of what I would refer to as super trainers. There are these household names that almost supersede the horses. Back, I think in the 70s and 80s, and certainly even before that, a lot of times people knew the horse. they didn't necessarily the connections behind the horse. And by that, I mean, they didn't necessarily the owner or the trainer. A lot of times they would know the jockey potentially, but a lot of it was about the horse. It was about secretariat. It was about citation. It was about Affirmed and Aladar and these great horses. And now you've seen that the trainers have become the superstars. The people behind the horses have become the superstars. And first among them is the silver-haired Bob Baffert. I mean, who is recognizable. He's got that all white head of hair, has for years. And of course, he was the trainer behind the two most recent Triple Crown winners in American Pharaoh and Justified. And so that was obviously American Pharaoh broke this incredibly long streak in which we had not seen a Triple Crown winner in many decades. And then American Pharaoh finally broke through and won the Triple Crown in a way that very few people thought any horse would be able to do anymore. And Baffert became even more of a celebrity and a superstar. But there are other names that are just kind of in the public consciousness. Guys like D. Wayne Lucas, who've been around for years. More up-and-coming names like Chad Brown or even Brad Cox, who are two names that have some entries in this year's race who are kind of up-and-coming trainers. Chad Brown, if you follow horse racing, turf horses in particular, if you watch turf races, if you watch them run on the turf, Chad Brown horses, phenomenal. Great trainer, always has some of the best horses in that space. Another guy, Todd Pletcher, has 4 horses in this year's Kentucky Derby field. So we'll talk a little bit more about him. Guys like Doug O'Neill and Steve Asmussen. These are names that are very well known in the horse racing community, but are also names that if you've watched the Kentucky Derby before, if you've watched it, every year, something like that, those names that I just mentioned, you probably, something, refreshed your memory, where you go, oh, I remember that, oh, I remember that person's name. Oh, I've heard that before. It's the trainers that have become the real superstars in this. And it's amazing to see how it is the same names that seem to keep coming up again and again and again at every year's Triple Crown and Kentucky Derby. Now, I mentioned earlier, how do you appreciate horse racing? And I think a lot of times people look at the race for the Triple Crown and they think about it as that's horse racing. And that is such a small, narrow understanding of horse racing. And listen, any entry point into a sport is a good thing. And if you get into horse racing because you enjoy the Triple Crown, great. But there's so much more to discover. First of all, you're only looking at 3-year-olds. A lot of times horses nowadays are lightly raced as 2-year-olds and then start really being raced in the winter and spring of their 3rd year. And so these are young horses. Therefore, they're very unpredictable in some ways. And you're looking at 3 races over a period of about 6 weeks or 5 weeks, I suppose. There's usually 2 weeks between the Derby and the Preakness, and then 3 weeks between the Preakness and the Belmont. And it's 3 races in a short period of time in a way that none of these horses have ever done that before. If you look at the general racing schedule, typically it's several weeks in between races for these horses. A lot of times it's at least a month in between these races. And so suddenly you're asking a very young horse that's been pretty untested to run against the best competition of their careers 3 times in 5 weeks. That is an incredible challenge. And that's what makes the Triple Crown so unbelievable. Because you're dealing with very young horses. You're dealing with, young thoroughbreds. Thoroughbreds are naturally unpredictable, but, young thoroughbreds in particular who are just for the first time being pushed the way that they are. And none of them rarely have ever ran the distance of the Belmont, that final race of 1.5 miles. So you're asking them to go further, to go faster against better competition than they ever had before. So it's no wonder that you start to see horses fall by the wayside in this challenge. And so in American breeding, the breeding of horses, I'm not going to go too far into this, but I'll just say that that has not helped things either, that horses are breaking down at a higher rate because of some of the practices behind wanting to breed for size and speed together. That's not a great combination. So, breeding for smaller, lighter horses sometimes can be a better advantageous thing. Also, just the way that the training is. If you follow horse racing over in Europe, a lot of times those horses can go much further distances, much more regularly, and it's because they have different breeding and different training regimens. But here in the United States, it's just a slightly different culture. And for those of us who love horse racing, it's always sad to see certainly the stories about horses having to get put down. You've seen a lot of that out in Santa Anita, out in California. And you just, I think the good news is that in recent years, there's been more spotlight shown on this type of issue. And so the health of these horses and the best breeding practices and training practices are starting to become much more widely available and much more widely practiced. And that's a good thing because these are beautiful, beautiful animals that we want to cherish and protect and watch them at their greatest and watch them at their best. So when you look at the Triple Crown, that's just a small snippet. I mean, obviously, horses keep running well beyond their third year in a lot of cases. Now, if they win the Triple Crown or if they win 2 of the 3 legs of the Triple Crown, a lot of them retire and just go out to sire and stud. But a lot of these horses will run as 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds. Horses keep running. And again, between turf racing and dirt racing, European racing versus, racing here in the States, there's just, the Breeders' Cup, which is not until November. And a lot of people, in the horse racing community actually view that as the more prestigious win in a lot of ways, because that sometimes shows who really is the great horse, because this is a horse now that has had a full year to mature, and you can start to get a sense of what really that horse is going to be for their career. So it's just fascinating to see, again, how maybe the general public views horse racing versus how those of us who follow it on a kind of a daily basis in some ways see it. And there really are. I mean, there's races going on every single day in parks across the country. And it's great theater, great entertainment. And it's something I encourage people to check out if they have the time. But interestingly, horse racing during the pandemic, as I mentioned, was largely uninterrupted. Like I said, it continued to operate across the country. Not a lot of fans, obviously. In fact, almost nobody in the stands. And that's going to be an interesting, aspect to this, is that when these horses come out from the paddock and they make their way onto the track, first of all, you're going to have everyone singing "My Old Kentucky Home," which is what which is what is played before the running of the Derby. So everybody's singing "My Old Kentucky Home." These horses come out. There's 45,000 people. These are young horses. Again, these are thoroughbreds. Thoroughbreds, for people who might not know, are very insane and are just very skittish animals, and it can be very unpredictable. Part of that has to do with the breeding, and maybe that there's some inbreeding going on, and it's not always the best for the mental state of these horses. And so you have these unpredictable horses, and they are now suddenly in front of people that they've never been in front of. Remember, these horses, when they were 2 years old, were racing during the pandemic. And now this spring, they've been racing as 3-year-olds during kind of the tail end. Maybe some of these tracks that they've been running at have allowed for some capacity, but really, by and large, they've been untested in front of large crowds. And so that's going to be really fascinating to see how these horses respond to being in front of 45,000 people. Do some of them rear up? Do some of them get anxious and need to get raced out a little bit and run out beforehand? But, are they going to get lathered up? Are they going to get, horses, you just really, no matter what I say later on in terms of predictions, it's going to be, I think this time, more than any that I can remember, watching how the horses react and walk around the paddock and walk out into the track, how they respond to that, I think is going to really tell this race in a lot of ways. And so if I was a bettor and a handicapper, I would not start putting money on this race until the very last second, even if I was confident in my picks, which we'll get to in a little bit. I am pretty confident in them. But even if I was confident in my picks, I would still want to wait to see how are these horses going to react. Are they going to react a certain way in front of a large crowd? And what is that going to be like? And are they going to, unfortunately get whipped up? Is anybody going to try to break early, have to get backed out, rear up while they're in the starting gate? Things like that. You have to worry about that in this sort of circumstance because they've just never experienced something like this before. So that's going to be the real challenge. And the Kentucky Derby field this year, let's talk a little bit about this. There's going to be a few scratches probably, but close to a 20 horse field. And so let's run through some of this. So the horses that are at the top of the betting odds right now, the favorite as I record this is the horse Essential Quality. This is a horse trained by Brad Cox. This is a horse that is appropriately the betting line favorite. Coming off at currently 5-2. That number will actually probably go down. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes under 2-1 by the time it is post time, if it's like 6-5 or an 8-5 sort of a odds. This is a 5-0 horse. So 5 wins, 5 consecutive wins. Almost all, the last 4 have all been over a mile. So this is a horse that has run at a good distance as a young horse, has won at a good distance, also has a good background. So was sired by the horse Tappet, which was won the Wood Memorial years ago, was a pretty good horse, but has become a very effective sire. Several of his offspring have been quite effective. So Essential Quality, like I said, offspring of Tappet, trained by Brad Cox, who's really establishing himself as one of the best in the game, and is consistently won on dirt at close to this length, running a mile and an eighth or a mile and a 16th. So, there's a lot to like there. The second horse is this in terms of odds right now is Hot Rod Charlie, coming in at 6-1. I do not like this horse. Won the Louisiana Derby. Didn't really love that pace at the Louisiana Derby. It was kind of a pretty slow pace and a really messy race, and just was not impressive. He was really pretty nondescript early this season. He's come on, won his last couple of races, but like I said, didn't do so, at least in my opinion, in an overwhelming fashion. Didn't really, blow me away. I don't think he's worthy of being the 6-1, second favorite to the race right now. I know a lot of handicappers like him. I'm not a big fan. He's also seen a few different trainers work with him. That lack of consistency, I worry about that coming into a big race. And so I'm just not the biggest fan of Hot Rod Charlie. Also, you've heard some rumors from people like Hank Goldberg, who cover horse racing pretty closely, that he's not been having the greatest workouts in Churchill, leading up to the Derby. So there's some concern there. So I would actually shy away from Hot Rod Charlie. Medina Spirit, this is an interesting one. Medina Spirit's currently 8-1. This is a Bob Baffert trained horse. And this is a horse, and there's another horse I'll talk about later. Highly Motivated, actually, is the name of the horse that I'll talk about later. But these are horses that I think, honestly, their odds are based upon their connections. If anyone other than Bob Baffert trained this horse, this is a 20-1, 25-1 type of a horse. I mean, has been nondescript out west. I mean, has finished second and third out in Santa Anita the last several times out. Hasn't, has won once. I mean, just has not been this dominant horse. Certainly not the trend line that you would be looking for out of a horse emerging into the Derby. Now, it's important to point out, listen, even the greatest horse of all time, Secretariat, lost his race before the Kentucky Derby, lost his final prep before the Derby. And so, you always have to take some of that with a grain of salt. But I would say that the Derby winner, it generally is a horse that is trending in the right direction. And Medina Spirit just doesn't seem to be trending in that direction. Like I said, been finishing in the money, but not winning out west. Not been a lot of great horses coming from out in California recently. So it'll be interesting to see how that horse does. Rock Your World is an 8-1 as well. That actually was the winner of Santa Anita. Like this horse a little bit more. Still don't love it. Like I said, some of these West Coast horses, I've not been a big fan of in recent years. So we'll see. The horse that I really like is a horse Known Agenda. And this is a horse that won the Florida Derby. And you're going to accuse me of being a Florida homer, right? I've been to Tampa Downs. I've been to the Florida Derby before. I love the horses coming out of there. But there's a reason for that. Listen to this statistic. 5 of the last 15 Kentucky Derby winners won the Florida Derby before winning the Kentucky Derby. So 5 of the last 15 Florida Derby winners went on to win the Kentucky Derby. That's pretty good, considering you have all of these horses coming from all over the country between Santa Anita and Keeneland and the Bluegrass and the Arkansas Derby, Louisiana Derby, the Wood Memorial. You have all of these, winners coming in and going into the Derby. The fact that 5 of the last 15 Derby winners won the Florida Derby should tell you a little something. And maybe this is a pretty good indicator. Also, the horse is trained by Todd Pletcher, one of those superstar trainers I mentioned. Todd has 4 horses in this year's Kentucky Derby field. So I think there's a lot to like with Known Agenda. I thought he looked good in the Florida Derby as well. So always I think a strong bet there. Highly Motivated. I mentioned I was going to talk about him a little bit. Trained by Chad Brown. Again, I think more by reputation. A lot of seconds and thirds most recently, has not been trending in the right direction. Again, if this was on turf, I think I'd probably give him even more of the benefit of the doubt because Chad Brown does amazing things for horses on turf. But I'm not seeing Highly Motivated being that serious contender. Great connections, a good horse, but I just don't think he is really a horse that's going to challenge. Just don't love it. Couple of other horses that I'll mention very quickly with alcohol-based names: Midnight Bourbon and Burbonic. So Midnight Bourbon is a 15-1 shot right now, trained by Steve Asmussen, and so that's a horse that I like a little bit in terms of those odds. Has been trending in the right direction. Burbonic won the Wood Memorial, again trained by Todd Pletcher, so good connections there. Going off very high numbers at 30-1. It wasn't super impressive in the Wood Memorial, but again, at 30-1, worth a shot. I mean, especially considering this is a horse that has won this year, is trending in the right direction. Granted, has not faced this caliber of field, but trained by the right type of people. And I think that's, something to point out. So, like I said, Pletcher in all has 4 horses in this Derby. So he has Known Agenda. He has Burbonic. He also has Dynamic One and Sainthood. The latter 2 are pretty long shots. But he's not the only one with multiple. Brad Cox, as I mentioned, has Essential Quality. Also has Cato River, who's going to be running as a little bit more of a long shot. And then Steve Asmussen has 2 horses. He has Midnight Bourbon as well as Superstock. So there's multiple trainers with multiple horses. And that's always an interesting dynamic. And you always have to, at least in my eyes, I always wonder about that, about whether or not trainers know that there are certain horses that are long shots that they have, and whether or not they tell those long shots to set the pace a certain way to help their odds-on favorite to win. And we saw this a few years ago. I can't help but remember the way in which Justified won the Belmont. One of Bob Baffert's other horses went out and really broke fast in a way that the horse never did before. And then it allowed for Justified to kind of get on the lead and eventually win the race. And something never sat quite right with me about that. Always seemed like Baffert was maybe pulling the strings between his different horses. And with, Pletcher having 4 horses in the race, it'll be interesting to see how those 4 horses work together potentially, set the pace, lay off the pace, what they try to do toward each other. Obviously, all of these jockeys are going to want to win for their own. So, you never tell any jockey or any horse not to win. But it will be interesting to see how race strategy plays out. So when it comes to betting, that's at the end of the day what a lot of people enjoy about the Derby. Even if it's just in your pool with your friends and family, if you get together to watch, what are some things to look for? Well, listen, I think Essential Quality is an appropriate betting line favorite. There's nothing not to like about the horse. It just keeps winning. It runs a good distance. And it's a gray colt. I'm always a big fan of grays. So it's just a pretty horse. I think, you shouldn't bet based off just the color of the horse, but listen, I sometimes I do. And so, Essential Quality, like I said, will probably win, but you're not going to make much money on that bet. You'd have to put down a lot of money to make a good amount back. So what you're always looking for is an angle, and that's where some more complicated bets coming in. So going with exactas or trifectas, where you're picking the top two or the top three finishes. I like to play exacta or trifecta boxes, and what that means is you give the person, these are my exacta boxes, my top two. It can finish in either order, first, second, or second, first. Doesn't matter. As long as those are the two horses that finish first and second in some order, then I win. Same thing with the trifecta box. Again, I give three horses. As long as those are the three horses that finish first, second, and third, doesn't matter what order they finish first, second, and third, I collect. So I like to try to seek out horses that will give you better odds. So this year, I mentioned Midnight Bourbon at 15-1. I like pairing, so if you go, listen, I really think Essential Quality is going to win. So maybe pair Essential Quality with Midnight Bourbon on an exacta box. Midnight Bourbon's coming in at 15-1, so you might make a little bit of money there. Or maybe even take a longer shot, something like the Dynamic one at 30-1. I could see that paying off potentially, an Essential Quality Dynamic one exacta box. That would pay off nicely. Dynamic one's at 30-1, so that's a good odds. I also really like Known Agenda, as I mentioned, coming off at 12-1. I actually like Known Agenda to win, to be honest with you. But this is, ways of spreading that money around. It's a lot like the roulette table. For those of you who might have played, you don't put all your money on one, number. You spread your money out. You put a little bit of money on odds and evens. You put your money on red and black. You put your money on some numbers. You put them between four numbers. You spread your money out. The same thing's true in horse racing. Put some money on exacta boxes, maybe trifecta box here or there. You put your money on a couple of to win, a couple to place, maybe depending, you put in money on a couple long shots. Spread your money around a little bit. That's a good way to make sure that you're going to recoup at least a little bit of that. So we finally get to the point where, listen, we got to go with the picks. And so Essential Quality is hard to bet against. But I'm not going to sit here and just pick chalk, essentially. I'm not just going to pick the favorite, even though it is tempting. And so because of my roots in Florida and because of some of the stats I mentioned earlier, I am going to go for Known Agenda as my 2021 Kentucky Derby winner. I like that Florida connection. I like the Pletcher connection. I think that's just a good connection for this race. So I like Known Agenda. If I was putting together a trifecta box, it would probably be Known Agenda, Essential Quality, and Midnight Bourbon. Put those in my trifecta box. I think you might have a little bit of success if you do that. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Amalfi at the Derby. Make sure to get your mint juleps nice and cool and your Derby pie nice and warm. And enjoy all of the great content on Amalfi Media. And make sure to subscribe to our YouTube feed and check out the new website at amalfimedia.com. Until Preakness, just remember, I'm your host, Matthew DeSantis, and it is now post time.